So you're absolutely right, Shambhavji, in terms of the narrative that has been thrust upon us. So I often look at this and see the role of the early colonialist in bringing about narrative. One should find it strange that we have got thousands of writers in the Indian context. Writers from, you can imagine, start wherever you want. If you want Yajnavalkya, if you want Vedavyasa, if you want Valmiki, if you want Aryabhatta, Bhaskara, all of our classical, medieval, and even recent writers, not one person talks about Aryan invasion. Not one person talks about the Aryan identity or the
Yes.
Dravidian identity. So here we are as insiders watching this bizarre situation where thousands upon thousands of Indic writers writing about themselves neither talk about Aryan or Dravidian. The one person who did talk about Dravidian in a tangential way was Adi Shankara, where he referred to himself as Dravida Shishu. And Dravida was used in the context of where the three oceans meet. I am the person
Right.
from the part of this place where this meets. Not as an identity, but as a regional marker. So we had this bizarre situation where not one Indic person talks about anything to do with Aryans, anything to do with Dravidians. However, when the colonialists came, all of a sudden you have a situation where there's a new narrative thrust upon us. And all this came about when William Jones, one of the first persons who studied this whole thing, he came to India in the 1700s. And he was a scholar of Latin, Greek, and he learned Sanskrit. And to his amazement, he found that the three languages are related: Latin, Sanskrit, and Greek. And he asked, how can this be?
Right.
So he came about with this idea that perhaps at some point in the remote past, these three languages are related because they were common people. And this
Right.
common people, he introduced a construct of Aryans. So pretty soon in colonial Indology came about this idea that people from Central Asia populated India as well as Europe because, you know, they got to explain where are the Greeks, who are the Greeks, and who are the Western. So it came about to describe them in that context. And as a side to that, they started saying that these people also entered India. So this is the roots, the genesis of this problem, if you will. And over the years, this has been layered. Initially, the first people who studied this problem were people who were linguists like William Jones and others who were looking at the linguistic category. Then anthropologists such as Risley, they jumped in. Now, anthropology is a bit of a discredited race science. So he came in and he started saying that the width of the nose and the length of the nose can be
Right.
used into a mathematical metric using which can classify the races of humans.
Right.
And he applied it in Scandinavian countries and European countries and tried to see various races there. The Nordic obviously was a standard.
Right.
Was the best standard. Came to India and he found a whole host of races also over here. So this person also was a census commissioner in India, in British India, 1900s or so. So he took the Jati Varna system classification and subverted it into something called caste that he referred to as caste. And so not only was he one of the persons who talked about the metrics of the nose, cranial capacity, cranial measurements, and things like that to talk about race, he also saw us as various castes, and he
Right.
introduced the notion of caste. So that is it. We have been burdened ever since William Jones, Risley, and people like Robert Caldwell, who were missionaries. So the powerhouses were the colonial people who wanted to rule the country, and the missionaries who wanted to convert the country.
Yep.
And obviously the Westerner who wanted to ask his identity, who is he as a person? So these three things have joined together. So the scientist, the social person, the social researcher, and the missionary have joined together and made this narrative. The missionary in terms of Robert Caldwell. Robert Caldwell who came in and looked at Tamil Nadu and he wanted to convert the population. And one way to do that was obviously introduce a division. He saw the southern Indians as the so-called Dravidians,
Right.
distinct from the northerners. And then began his ministry, the division, and many people have internalized this idea. And till today, you find people who so strongly hold on to the spurious identity of Dravidian and
Right.
not so much Aryan. Dravidian identity is more vigorously held. You don't
Yeah,
find
it's an interesting one because you don't see a lot of North Indians walking around saying we are Aryans, or we are proud Aryans or something like that. You don't see that a lot, but you see that Dravidian identity, and then you have these movements that connect this Dravidian identity to this African American identity, and like I think it's because of that whole race science aspect of it, right? Where
right.
Dravidians are apparently supposed to be this different race that were oppressed by the evil Aryans, just like the African Americans were oppressed by the slave traders and so on and so forth. And I think the Aryan invasion theory, at least a part of it, also has to do with how when the Christian missionaries maybe came to India to proselytize people, and they saw that okay, there's evidence here that this civilization existed possibly before the universe was apparently even created. So how is that possible? So we need to do something where we can fit India into this area where India came into being after the universe was conceived and not before.
You're absolutely right. So into this whole issue where the people after William Jones try to study the chronology of India, they needed to write a history of India and the chronology of India. And to their astonishment, they found that many of these things were going back, the claims at least, in some of the, like Purana, for example, the chronological account of king lists in Puranas, going back to the time of Parikshit, basically the grandson of the Pandavas. From that period on, there's an unbroken king list going all the way to the Gupta Empire. And so they couldn't make sense out of it. How is it possible that here are a people whose history is going back to even before the so-called Noah's flood event?
Right.
So they were people who came from a time when in England, a particular bishop over there of the Anglican Church, he put together the chronology from the Old Testament, who begat whom and who begat whom and all of these kind of things, and started up adding the biblical chronology, genealogy from Adam all the way downwards. And he came to the conclusion that God created the world at 4004 BCE, sometime after that. I don't remember the exact date, but that's what he said. Further, God destroyed the world approximately 3000 BC, Noah's flood. So nothing could have survived that flood event. So these guys are astonished. So, like I said in my earlier talks, they took it upon themselves to correct the so-called chronological problems in the Indian calendar. So they went about cherry picking. And their fortuitous moment came when they tried to see the synchrony between the so-called Sandrakutos and Chandragupta Maurya. So in the Greek records, they had an account that there was contact with a king called Sandrakutos. And so the phonetic equivalent, they said this is Chandragupta Maurya. Whereas from the Indic context, it was clear that the Chandragupta Maurya they're talking about is perhaps to be dated about 1200 years prior to that event. Prior to
Yes.
the Chandragupta Maurya event. This is a different Chandragupta Maurya they're talking about. Anyway, the synchrony that they did over there said they give the aha moment. Now they connect from a world history that they know in the Greek world and other things, along with the Indian world. There's an anchor point. They've anchored Sandrakutos to Chandragupta Maurya. Having done that, they worked backward and said Buddha, approximately 500 BCE, and they progressively moved that downwards to 400, 300, and so on. And now, once again, shot back ever since they found the Buddhist temple in Lumbini.
Right.
Archaeological remains is 525 BCE. It's not possible that Buddha was born after that.
Right.
So things are in a flux over there. But the bottom line is the chronology was distorted. The chronology was distorted by the same colonialists who tried to make sense out of Indian chronology by force fitting it into their worldview, which unfortunately today has been layered upon by so many people. So once William Jones started this chronology, then came along the the relationship of Sanskrit to other European languages. Then came the anthropologists who started with their own race science and all of those things. Things started getting layered upon, layered upon. And right now, we are at a situation where the Western society has built up an enormous edifice against which we had to battle. As contrarian researchers, we need to go and say, no, this can't be true. But the issue is that when you try to battle one point, there are so many other intertwined points that we need to battle upon. difficult battle, but we need to look at it from various angles. And so today, luckily, we've got tools like genetics. We are once again examining archaeoastronomy, some of the data points that are examined in the past, once again bringing it to the fore and saying that we need to take account of all of these things. Archaeology in our country is now matured to a point where some of the dates that are being contemplated are no longer wishful thinking, but you have artifacts on the ground that tell you that things are ancient enough. So, bottom line, new lines of evidence are coming in to challenge the old narratives.
So maybe let's touch on a couple of those maybe lines of evidence. So let's look at, let's say, in your talks you were talking about some of the archaeogenetic evidence that was coming through, and you mentioned one of the studies that I found very interesting, and I think that was the Oppenheimer study that was calculated or that estimated that there was a movement that came when people migrated first out of Africa, that they migrated through India and then outwards into Europe rather than the other way around. So maybe let's start with some of the archaeogenetics and then maybe move on to some of the archaeological, and then we can sort of move into astronomy from there.
True. So I think we need to place things in perspective before we go deep into this. So human migrations has been the subject of study of a lot of people for a lot of time. So the question is, when you start talking about the humans, who are you talking about? We have several species over here.
Right.
We've got the Homo sapiens, we have got the Neanderthals, we have got the Homo erectus, and so many other species. And who is it that we're talking about? Now, we have got proof that in India, the Homo erectus has been existing for maybe more than 2 million years.
Wow.
We have artifacts in Narmada Valley, in Son Valley, Bias Valley, and many other places. We got artifacts from Homo erectus going back to 500,000 years ago, going back to 300,000 years ago. Even recently, there was a find in Tamil Nadu, which came to around 300,000 years ago, and there was some head scratching on, is this species Homo erectus or is this Homo sapien? So I find the division to be a little artificial. Who says that here is a distinction from Homo erectus to Homo sapien? What are the distinctive characteristics that go from one to the other? Now, there are paleontologists and others have got some very well-defined scientific measures that say that if the cranial capacity is so much, if the thigh bone looks like this, and bear this way, they're walking upright. There are several ideas which have been brought about into science which say this is the distinction from one species to the other. So when we talk about human migrations, we should keep this in mind. That what are we really talking about? So we are talking here about Homo sapien now. Now the Homo sapien migratory research, genetic migratory research using the maternal mitochondrial DNA has shown that they came out of Africa, somewhere near Kenya perhaps, or Tanzania, in those areas. And the early Homo sapien left Africa in two waves. One wave, approximately 140,000 years ago, crossed the Levant and went towards Europe, but that branch died out because of ice ages and other things. There's no trace of them in the genetic record after that. The next crossing was approximately 85,000 years ago, where they crossed over the Red Sea, and they were beach huggers, basically hugged the beach coastline, and through Oman, through Iran, through Sindh, Gujarat, triangular part of India, all the way into Sumatra, into Taiwan, all those kind of areas. This migration was in the period from 85,000 years or so on. So this was based upon looking at the maternal mitochondrial DNA. Stephen Oppenheimer has provided a lot of archaeological evidence also to show that there are artifacts, like, for example, they found areas where they excavated human settlements where they were eating shellfish. The fact that they were eating shellfish is an indicator they were beach huggers. They were not going into the interior and hunting big animals and eating them. They were hugging the beach. And the question comes, why did they do that? They probably did that because they didn't want to confront the Neanderthals in Iran. They did not want to confront the huge animals, perhaps in India, wild animals. India probably had a lot of tiger, probably had a lot of wild elephants, other things. And perhaps the early human did not have the technology to stave them off. Right. So they had to hide and move on. So there are some ideas, but these are speculative ideas. But they come and we try to construct the story. So from 85,000 years on, we go to the Mount Toba event. The Mount Toba event was a super volcano in Sumatra, which covered India and Pakistan with about 6 meters of ash. Once that happened, the human species almost got extincted.
Right.
And it statistically shown that a repopulation of the earth took place with less than 1,000 breeding individuals.
Wow.
Can you just less than 1,000 breeding individuals are supposed to have repopulated the non-African population of the world.
That's incredible.
So, incredible. And then there is this researcher called Ravi Korisetter who's been working in Jwalapuram in Andhra Pradesh. So his excavations are focused on this layer, precisely this layer, where he's gone and found the ash layer. And under the ash layer, he's found human artifacts, like all the tools that they used. And then there is this ash layer, no sign of humans again. Then there's a resettlement of India, and again, artifacts above the ash layer. Fascinating work, because this kind of work shows that there were humans existing before the event, and
Right.
there's a resettlement after the event.
Wow.
So now we know, correlating with paleoclimatology and other such things, that when the ice ages ended in Europe, approximately 60,000 years or so, it coincided with the dying out of the Neanderthals, and the Homo sapien filled in that vacuum. They crossed from Sindh, Gujarat, that area. They migrated outwards towards the Bosphorus, and they went on and became the future Europeans.
Yes.
At the same time, Indians from this part of India, from the eastern part of India, and from Sumeria part of the world, they migrated northwards into Siberia and crossed the then land bridge and became the Native Americans. So
Oh, wow.
very, very fascinating that, if we can call it, our recent Homo sapien history, recent meaning 80,000 years ago, it shows on the maternal mitochondrial DNA that is a very strong story. We are out of Africa. Again, keep in mind that we are not talking about Homo erectus, which
Yes.
had its home in India going back to 2 million years or so.
That's incredible as well. And there's so much, you were talking about the archaeological evidence that exists as well, where this narrative has been created, okay, that there was the Dravidians that existed in the Indus Valley civilization, and the Aryans came, or before the Indus Valley civilization, Aryans came and then pushed them towards the south, and then created the Indus Valley civilization, so to say. But then there's so much archaeological evidence that exists in southern India of existence of a fully functioning culture, civilization. And one of the most interesting things that you were talking about was I think it was the example of Kiridi, if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yes.
So talk. Maybe let's talk a little bit about the archaeological evidence that debunks this theory as well.
Sure. So now we got to come to more recent times. So people have been talking, okay, all of this is about 80,000 years, 60,000 years. What about recent times? The Aryans are supposed to have come to India around 1500 BCE,
Yep.
and occupied the plains of northern India around 500 BCE, chased all the original inhabitants to the south. The Dravidians came to the record in 500 BCE. This is the common narrative that many people have internalized, and even today the hardcore Dravidians from Tamil Nadu who talk about identities like this.
Yes.
So our interest is to see, is there any support for this in genetics as well as in archaeology? So you open the question of archaeology. So let's look at archaeology. In northern India, we have seen Rakhighari, Birhana, and other places where settlements have gone up to about 9,500 years before present, approximately 3,000 BCE, let us say. They found artifacts over there. Who are these guys?
Right.
Whether the precursors or the so-called Harappans, or who are these guys? So question is, there is some data point over here that does not add up. So let's put that on one side. Then all along the paleo channels of Saraswati, as well as the Ganga and other things, we have found settlements. And these settlements are very ancient, going back 5,000 BCE, 6,000 BCE, and so on, opening up the question once again. If there was such widespread settlements all over India, does it make sense to say that here these people are all Harappans and new races come in? So it again opens up a second data point. Now, people have said the lack of archaeological artifacts in southern India shows to us that people first settled the north and then came from the north into the south, and that's how they. So if we find anything in the south that is earlier than 500 BCE, we have an aha moment. That's saying that what is this? So I believe there have been very many archaeological artifacts found in the south. For example, the Edekal caves, the Arikamede, as well as in burials, urn burials all over Tamil Nadu going back to 100,000 years ago, 150 very ancient artifacts have been found in Tamil Nadu. There's no doubt about that. Then if you go looking for megaliths, dolmens, and other such things, Tamil Nadu, whole of southern India is filled with it, whether it is Kerala, whether it is Karnataka, Andhra, or Tamil Nadu. You have artifacts that show huge constructions. Constructions, for example, there's a Stone Age construction. We are lucky to brush them away saying this is Stone Age is not civilization.
Right.
Point, why would people whose preoccupation is survival, hunting, gathering, and survival, come together and chop off a huge slab of granite, huge tons of it, lift it up and make pillars and dolmens out of these things and megaliths out of this? What is it? There's got to be some social organization. There's got to be some primitive religion, if you will. The word primitive is used in the lightest sense of the word.
Yes,
but the point is that there's got to be some social organization for people to come together and do something. We don't admit these things in our narrative. Rather, we look for evidence of roads and civilization and so on. All right, even there, Kiradi burst into the news some time back saying that this archaeologist had found some miles away from Madurai, he had found this artifact there, this remnants of an ancient city. And they took some stratum of ground from Kiradi and sent it off to Florida for carbon dating. So these guys came and said that it's probably dated to around 300 BC or so on. So this fits very well into the common narrative. The common narrative saying that any artifact southern India should be 500 BC and later. That's when Dravidians appeared in the record. However, I asked that question that you dug in Kiradi up to 4.5 meters. You took artifacts in the middle layer, somewhere in the middle layer, and sent it off, and that was dated to around 300 BC. So if you do a linear mapping, linear scale, if the top layer is 2018 and the middle layer corresponds to 2000 years ago in 2 meters, that means every meter approximately is about 1000 years.
Yeah.
I don't have my math in my head immediately, just an example, 1000 years, right. Linear dating. Now people can contest that. They can say that doesn't make sense. But then the point is, if you don't have anything else to go by, we as scientists need to make use of the metrics that we can start with. It could be a linear metric, maybe non-linear, it's better. But the point is, I don't have that non-linear metric yet. So let's start with a linear metric and then take it from there and refine it with future measurements, make it better. That's the methodology we follow. So if we take the linear methodology saying that from top layer to middle layer is 2000 years, then middle to 4.5 meters depth goes beyond 3000 BCE.
Wow.
If it goes beyond 3000 BCE, then the question comes, wait a minute, are we talking about an urban settlement in southern India in 3000 BCE? Whoa!
Yeah, who are these people? Where were these? They suddenly dropped from the sky. What happened?
Exactly. So people would say that, people use the middle layer because that's where carbon artifacts were found. If you're doing carbon dating, obviously we need carbon artifacts, so C14 dating. It's got to say how much of radioactive content is there. So you need something like either remains of food or food grains or agricultural material or any carbon-based life form material if there can be done. So there was some noises saying that in that layer at 4.5 meters, they did not find carbon material.
Right.
That is not an excuse. Because I did not find a layer there, I'll stop with where I found it and say that is a day. Well, that's exceedingly cautious to say that I'm dating this to 300 BCE because you're leaving a huge story untold. I think you have to be more embracive and say that we found a range of artifacts. We found a range of artifacts from 300 BCE, perhaps going all the way to 3000 BCE. But the problem is that we have politicized these things so much in our country that people can't come out and say the things they want to say because this identity issue is something that people don't have a grasp on. The scientists don't have a grasp on it. The government doesn't have a grasp on it. Politicians don't have a grasp on it. Academicians don't have a grasp on it. Missionaries love to have a different kind of narrative.
Right.
too many power brokers here, too many power brokers and too much.
It's such a strange thing because it's almost like saying that, okay, now humans are going to go to the moon and we're going to explore the moon, but we're not going to explore any further because we don't know what we might find. It's almost like saying that.